All right, chapter 21. So this one is on the lymphatic system. Now, the organization of the PowerPoint for this chapter, I rearranged it so it makes more sense. That's why it's called remixed. Yeah, it is part of the feedback that I got from, when you have the feedback from some students, especially ones that I know should be able to pick up stuff very easily. One of them was even a president's list student, which means you have a 4.0. Even when they're like, yeah, this is a confusing layout. So that's why it is in a different organization than it is in the chapter in the book, but it helps with organizing the information in together with each other versus, we talk about this here, and then at the end of the chapter we go back to those same cells we talked about earlier, but then there's a lot that's had to rearrange. So that's why this is going to be completely different than the way the other PowerPoints that you've seen, the way they look, and of course with the organization with the chapter. Okay, so there were some things where I also added kind of a ways to reference what I'm talking about. So it does get a little corny, but again, it's to help you have reference for the topics. So in the lymphatic system, what I call the lymphatic veils, so ignore that one. But it helps with our circulatory system as well as our digestive system. And our white blood cells, our immune response team, their job is to basically fight off the pathogens, which are their rivals. And they do so for your entire life, except for postseason death bowl, where, eventually you die off, so they can't just kill off everything. Okay, so jobs of the lymphatic system: helps with fluid recovery. So your capillaries, they reabsorb about 85% of the fluid that they drop off. The rest of it is picked up by your lymphatic system. Helps with immunity. So with our lymphatic high state champs, so thinking like high school football kind of situation, those white blood cells, that's their job, helping our body to fight against any kind of invaders. And then lastly, lipid absorption. So with the unique structure of our lymphatic vessels, if you remember that picture from, actually I think it was just last chapter, the structure of that, which we'll come look at it in a second, it is different and allows for a larger passage of materials, and so that allows for not only different pathogens to be entered into our lymphatic system, but also with our lipids as part of digestion. They're packaged in a way that allows them to be in the fluid, aqueous, water-like environment or hydrophilic environment of the body. So that packaging is fairly large, and so it needs to be picked up by the lymphatic system because it's larger and too big to get into your circulatory system, at least immediately, with the small blood vessels and whatnot. Okay, so first job, fluid recovery. So again, about 15% of the fluid that's pushed out the capillary is picked up by your lymphatic system. So it kind of works as a backup for your lymphatic system. So when that fluid is picked up from the tissues, it's called lymph. So it's the recovered fluid from the interstitial or extracellular space. That lymph is transported through your lymphatic vessels. The inside your lymphatic system, you also have different lymphatic tissues, so just kind of more areas where you have a high concentration of your white blood cells, as well as other macrophages, which we'll talk about later. Their job is just helping with your immune response. And then some places where you have a whole lymphatic organ. So this is similar to your lymphatic tissue, except for it's all encapsulated with a connective tissue. So that's why it's called this organ. It's actually has its own separate structure. Excuse me. So what is lymph? Lymph is the clear, colorless fluid, very similar to plasma, since again that fluid has been filtered from plasma, but less protein. Again, the proteins are too large to escape your capillaries, and so they're not getting pushed into your extracellular space so they can't be picked up as the lymph. So the extracellular fluid drawn into the lymphatic capillaries and then travels through your lymphatic system, but eventually gets dumped back into your bloodstream. So depending on where you are, the composition can vary. So for example, in the intestines, you're going to have, for example, a large amount of your lipid pickup, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to pick up those packaged lipids from your digestive system. And then after it passes through your lymph nodes, it's filtered out. You have your white blood cells. They're doing their job. So they're fighting off the pathogens that are there. So you're going to have a little bit of differences depending on where you are. Okay, let's look at these lymphatic vessels. So similar to your blood vessels and how they had different names, your lymphatic vessels, depending on their size, can have different names. So we go from our lymphatic capillaries to collecting vessels, and this size of lymphatic vessels also include lymph nodes. That's where they're located, and then they dump into larger and larger vessels, and then eventually getting into your venous blood supply, specifically your subclavian veins, to return that fluid back to your blood. So focusing on getting our lymph into the tissue. So that's where our lymphatic capillaries are. So they're located right where your regular capillaries are. And again, just like your regular blood capillaries, you don't have lymphatic capillaries in areas where they would get squeezed or that would interfere with function. So like cartilage, cornea, bone marrow, they're not there. So the structure of these lymphatic capillaries is that the endothelial cells, they overlap each other a little bit, and that just kind of creates a door flap where fluid can be pushed into it. So it creates ability to have a larger opening for other stuff. So because this little flap between the overlap of the cells allows for larger things to come in, allowing for bacteria, viruses, and then of course our packages for our lipids to actually be able to go into our lymphatic capillaries. So those open spaces, they're open only when there's a high enough pressure to flap them open. So to kind of push against that door, if you will, to allow the fluid to come in. So that's also going to allow the larger objects to also come in. So again, it's in the same area where your regular capillaries are, so they can pick up that excess fluid. Okay, you don't have to know the layers of your lymphatic vessels, but similar to our blood vessels, they do have different layers with different functions, but I could care less. So eventually, all your stuff gets collected into the collecting ducts. So we have a right one and one thoracic one, and they'll empty into the right and left subclavian vein. So that's how the fluid from the lymphatic system goes from the lymphatic system back into your blood supply. So there's similar forces to move lymphatic fluid through your lymphatic vessels. It's not in your study guide, so I'm going to skip it. Okay, let's look at our different tissues. So our lymphatic tissues are where you have aggregations, so bundles or a bunch of your lymphocytes, so your white blood cells in a particular type of area. So you got two different types. We have a diffuse lymphatic tissue, so that's just where there's a big collection of them. And then you have the lymph nodules or lymph nodes on your collecting vessels, and you'll have a bunch of lymphocytes in that lymph node as well. So the simplest form is our lymphatic tissue, and this is just in different areas of the body where they're open to the outside of the body, so they're more likely to receive a pathogen, and so there are big collection of these white blood cells there to fight off anything that has possibly gotten to the body through that area. Okay, lymph nodes. So these are a more specified type of lymphatic tissue along those collecting vessels. Bunch of lymphocytes and macrophages there because as you collect fluid from your tissues, it's also able to pick up those pathogens. And because you have those white blood cells there, you're able to kind of initiate a response to them. So these are in areas where, again, your lymph nodes, tonsils is also an area that's very similar, and the appendix. So your appendix is that little dangly thing off of near the start of your large intestines. And other than just having a bunch of white blood cells, that's all we know about it, of what it does. So it might have been some kind of like evolution something, and it had a bigger feature, used to be, but whatever. It's just this little dangly thing off the start of your large intestines. A bunch of white blood cells there. Okay. So for our lymph nodes, there again, they're located on collecting vessels, and they have areas where you have a bunch of lymph nodes that are collected together, or congregated together. So the easiest way to remember where these are the places where you kind of have bendy parts. So your neck, your armpit region, the trunk, your groin. So again, kind of bend forward, you can bendy places. Your elbows and the knees. So places where you bend, that's where you're going to have a good collection of your lymph nodes. So this is because as you're draining fluid, obviously having it in your extreme areas like your hands or feet, you haven't actually collected much. So this allows you to collect a bunch and then get to an area where you can filter out the lymph. You can also start off any possible infection, like if you cut your hand and there's bacteria goes in the hand, then it can go to a lymph node in your elbow or in your armpit, and then eventually it's going to go back towards the heart region because it gets dumped into that subclavian vein. Okay, so your lymph nodes are located essentially at your bendy part. So let's look at some lymphatic organs. Sorry, I accidentally skipped this when I was going through this section. So as your lymph is going through your lymphatic vessels, just like your regular veins, there are valves that are going to prevent the backflow of lymph. So just like those saloon doors, you have these kind of saloon door features on your lymphatic vessels. So as the lymph gets pushed through one, it gets to that next section, and that door is going to keep it from coming back to the back section. So push the next one, it stops from going backwards. Push to the next one, so stops it from going backwards. So those valves help with that. Okay, back to our lymphatic organs. So again, these are wrapped in a type of connective tissue, which makes them more defined than other types of lymphatic tissues. So we have two different sets of lymphatic organs, the primary ones being our red bone marrow and the thymus. So this is where our T and B cells become immunocompetent, which means they are able to recognize and respond to a foreign antigen. So basically, this is where they have developed and have the ability or the license to kill. So they can actually be functional in your immune system. Secondary ones, this is where these immunocompetent cells will go to, and they will go to your lymph nodes, tonsils, and spleen. So this is just looking at the production again in your red bone marrow, so your hemopoiesis, blood formation, and then they go into the bloodstream, but then eventually go to your tissues. So one place that our immunocompetent cells will be is in the thymus. So this is where our T lymphocytes will develop. So the B lymphocytes develop in the blood. So really, particularly the red bone marrow. Okay, so the thymus is where your developing lymphocytes will be, and so that's where they get tested to make sure that they are immunocompetent, so are able to fight off an infection. So inside this thymus, where you have these developing cells, the ones that aren't immunocompetent are still developing. They're located on this outside cortex region, and then there is a barrier between them so that this part that's exposed to your bloodstream will not interact with cells that we don't know if they are able to correctly respond to a cell surface antigen, because you don't want them that are, how do I say this? We don't want immature ones that might possibly react to a self-antigen, so your own glycocalyx, to be able to enter in your bloodstream and start attacking regular cells. So there's your barrier. Okay, lymph nodes, 2 functions. Clean the lymph, so it gets filtered as it goes through these lymph nodes, and it acts as a site of T and B cell activation. So once these cells have become immunocompetent in either the thymus or in your red bone marrow, they are sent away, deployed into the lymph nodes, and so they're able to react to any pathogen that's in the lymph, and so that activates them, and then they form their immune response based on that specific pathogen. So your lymph nodes are your most numerous. Again, they're in all your little bendy parts, so it's a bunch of them. And again, they're located on your collecting vessels. This just shows you how they function. We'll cover this later, how when B cells are activated, they will differentiate into plasma cells, and those plasma cells are the one that's going to make your antibodies. So these are showing where all these lymph nodes are located. So again, your bendy parts mostly, where you've had some space to collect some fluid and then able to filter it out and possibly have picked up any pathogens. So I'm going to skip through some of this. Okay, tonsils. So these tonsils, they are located at the entrance of the pharynx, so in the back of your throat region. They have one job and one job only: to guard against ingested or inhaled pathogens. This is why sometimes your throat gets sore if you have like an infection or whatever, because those tonsils that are back there, they're the ones that have are reacting to that foreign pathogen, and so they're swollen and they get irritated, and so sore throat. Okay. So you have 3 main sets of tonsils, and although you don't have to know them for the test, just know its general function. I'm just going to show it to you just because this is something that, especially our nursing people, you'll have to deal with. So we have our palatine tonsils, and that's the one that's most infected because either you breathed in something or because it came in through your mouth. It's right there and possibly could get infected in either way. So this is your most infected one. Lingual tonsils are by the tongue, so just kind of reference there. And the last one is your pharyngeal tonsils, also called your adenoids. So this is the one, if you go get a COVID test or if you even get a flu test, that's where they're sticking that Q-tip into. They're rubbing up against that pharyngeal tonsil, rubbing to see if they can get see if you get that detection of that virus. Next type of lymphatic organ going to talk about is the spleen. So I've referenced this before as your blood sponge. So in your spleen, you have 2 different types of tissue. The red pulp is where your erythrocytes are housed. Your white pulp is where your white blood cells or lymphocytes and macrophages are held. So you do have a good blood supply to your spleen. You have just kind of a nice storage of your healthy red blood cells. They can come and go depending on your personal needs. This is also where your erythrocytes can go to die. So as they get beaten up during circulation, there's little small blood vessels in your spleen, and so they end up getting ripped up. And all those macrophages that just happen to be there, and they're going to do their job of eating stuff. So they'll do phagocytosis. So that's the phage portion of macrophage. Okay, so what's the job of the white pulp? So that's to monitor for foreign antigens. So that's what the lymphocytes are going to do. They can detect foreign glycocalyxes, and when needed, it can release monocytes. So they have a particular job dealing with your immune system response. And so they'll just be released as in, hey, we detected a pathogen. Let's release all these extra forces to go help out the other white blood cells that are already in our different tissues. You also can use the spleen to stabilize blood volume. So there's plasma that can be stored in the spleen. So again, spleen's like a blood sponge. And transfer that to your lymphatic system, which eventually will get dumped into your blood supply. So we'll start here dealing with our immune response for the next video. See you in a little bit, sort of.